Okay. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
All you hardy folks who are braving the cold to come out, and thank you. It helps to warm me and it helps to warm the room, and so thank you. We're being taped this morning for the first broadcast that we'll have of a Sunday school class. And this morning we're in the second phase of a two-part series on the life of David Brainard, first Presbyterian missionary to Native Americans, principally the Delawares, but also the Shinnecox and the Mohegans and other tribes up in the Northeast. So in order to begin this morning, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for people who have handed down to us a tradition of service. We thank you for the life of David Brainard and his example. We thank you for the diary he left behind to record his activities and what we can learn from them. So open our minds and hearts this morning to learn what you have to teach us through the actions and words of your servant, David Brainard. In your name we pray. Amen. Because we are in a two-part series, and we showed you last week the first part of a presentation on the life of David Brainard done by people who have researched his life backwards and forwards. I won't put you through sitting through the first half of this again, but for the benefit of those who are watching online, I need to give you a background of what you missed from last week. David Brainard was born in 1718 in Haddam, Connecticut. He was born into a Christian family with a history of ministers in that family. He lost his parents at a very early age. I think one at age 8 and one at age 14. So in that short period of time, people who are of a pilgrim tradition would have built into their children a lot of information about Christianity. Words like atonement would have meant something to him. Salvation would have meant something to him. He would have understood the principles of grace. And so when he got to be 20 or 21, he had a real confrontation with the Lord, and he became, as we would call, saved. But it was more than just words. It was a real heart change, and he felt led to go into ministry. So he applied for admission to Yale. Some of the people who were advising him felt that Harvard had become too liberal by that time. And so they felt that Yale might be a better place for him. But when he got to Yale, he found that it was primarily intellectualism. In other words, people were really understanding the theology and had the head knowledge, but didn't have the heart knowledge. And therefore, he found that it was kind of a cold place, a place where it was dry, and he didn't find the life of the Spirit that he really had been looking for or had experienced personally. And so he was really, in a sense, a product of the First Great Awakening, which involved people like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, who were circulating around that area, speaking at Yale and other places. And he had a sense of what this Great Awakening was. And when he got to Yale and found out that this was really an intellectual experience at that place, at least by the faculty, he began to consider that, gee, we need to put the life into this institution. And he, along with other students, tried to bring some reform, which really brought him into conflict with members of the faculty. And one day he was talking with a friend of his, and he said, this professor is no more alive to Christ than this chair. And the word got back to this professor, and who had been looking for an excuse to probably get rid of this troublemaker. And he was brought up on charges and dismissed. And so he searched for another way of expressing himself in Christian terms, and he turned to another organization that had asked him if he would be interested in working with Native Americans. This was an organization out of Scotland. It was called the Society for the Preservation of the Proclamation of the Gospel. Started in Scotland, and originally was to really get the Scots to pick up on this kind of enlightenment, or this kind of new way of thinking about Christ and Christianity and what it meant to become a Christian. So he began to work with Native American communities, principally the Delawares, but he was also with the Shinnecox and the Mohegans and others. He had very limited success at the start. He was trying to find his way. There weren't too many people who had had this kind of experience, not too many ministers who wanted to go out into the wilds and really deal with Native Americans and what that meant in terms of lifestyle, separation from those that you had a lot more familiarity and history with, language difficulties, living conditions, food conditions, and so it was a real challenge for him to accept that kind of responsibility. And so I want to just kind of illustrate that for you by reading a letter that he wrote to his younger brother, John, who by this time had gone back into Yale University. But this letter illustrates, I think, what was really at the heart of David Brainard. Dear brother, I should tell you, I long for you, to see you, but that my own experience has taught me there is no happiness and plenary satisfaction to be enjoyed in earthly friends, though ever so near and dear, or in any other enjoyment that is not God himself. Therefore, if the God of all grace would be pleased graciously to afford us each his presence and grace, that we may perform the work and endure the trials he calls us to in a most distressing, tiresome wilderness till we arrive at our journey's end. The local distance at which we are held from each other at the present is a matter of no great moment or importance to either of us. But alas, the presence of God is what I want. I live in the most lonely, melancholy desert, about 18 miles from Albany, for it was not thought that best that I should go to Delaware River, as I believe I hinted to you in a letter from New York. I board with a poor Scotchman. His wife can scarce speak any English. My diet consists mostly of hasty pudding, boiled corn and bread baked in the ashes, and sometimes a little meat and butter. My lodging is a little heap of straw laid upon some boards a little way from the ground, for it is a log room without any floor that I lodge in. My work is exceeding hard and difficult. I travel on foot 1.5 miles each way almost daily and back again, for I live so far from the Indians. I have not seen an English person this month. There may be many other circumstances as uncomfortable attend me And yet my spiritual conflicts and differences so far exceed all these that I scarce think of them or hardly mind, but that I am entertained in the most sumptuous manner. The Lord grant that I may learn to endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. The letter goes on, but it gives you a sense, maybe, of some of the hardships that David Brainard had to put up with. And I want to, I made some notes so I wouldn't leave too much out. I hope I don't anyway. May be helpful for people who are watching online to realize what was going on the frontier at that time and what was driving people to come to this country from Europe. Europe was filled with monarchs who were really controlling everything. You had the divine right of kings. They owned everything, and their barons and earls and all these different titles had land, and the rest of the population worked for them as their serfs. And so people who had an opportunity to come to a new land where land was available and you could actually own it for the first time, that was a huge inducement. The other thing that was happening was that there was a lot of persecution. If you didn't think the way the king thought or the queen thought, or believe the way he or she decreed that you would believe, you were subject to a lot of persecution. And there was a lot of hangings and burning at the stake and everything else that had gone on in Europe. And so people had a desire to really have freedom to worship as they pleased. By this time, the Bible had been translated, and there were all kinds of different movements throughout Europe that conflicted with some of the teachings of that the kings and queens believed in. So these people come to the United States, or what was the colonies at that time, and what they find is native people. And native people are here who have absolutely no knowledge of fee simple. For them, the land is available for all to use. You could set up your house wherever you wanted to. When you were finished with it and moved on, somebody else could occupy it. And so this whole concept of owning land that was so precious to Europeans was a totally foreign concept to Indian people. The people who moved here also, despite the fact that they understood Christian principles, had terrible bias. They looked at Indians as being people who were, in some cases, subhuman, because that was a way you could justify expropriating their land. So if you had people that were much like animals that you were using for food, they could be displaced and you could take their place. It's abhorrent to us to think that way today, but that was going on. Another thing that was happening at that particular time that would become a problem for David Brainard and other missionaries was traders pushing alcohol on native people. Native people had a history of using alcohol, but it was fermented alcohol. It was alcohol they used in order to get visions in their spiritual quest. It was something you used for religious services. It wasn't something that was used for only Friday or Saturday night. But when traders came and they wanted to take advantage, or if they wanted to gain advantage in terms of land, they began pushing distilled alcohol. And distilled alcohol is a whole different game. And it's a whole lot stronger. And this was a real problem for missionaries who were trying to counsel the Indians not to fall prey to all of this. Several of the things that I think made David Brainard's ministry effective was that he didn't look down upon Indians. He looked at them as human beings who needed a savior. And he wanted them to have the same experience of the heart that he had had. And he wanted them to have a great awakening, just like the great awakening that was sweeping through the colonies. And that was his goal. That was his. He was consumed by that. There were some things that he had to work with that were similar to the way in which Indians believed with Christianity. One of them is they gave obeisance to the four winds, north, south, east, and west. And of course, you've got the 4 points of the cross. So there was a way of identifying symbolically with Christianity. Indians also understood blood sacrifice. And so the atonement of blood for indiscretions or problems was a concept that they had some rudimentary knowledge of. Some Indian tribes actually had the Golden Rule as a part of their religious belief. And that was a place of commonality. And there was also a common belief that there is an afterlife, that when you died, you would go to a happy hunting ground beyond the sunset. So these were things that he had to work with, but he had to find somebody who would be able to help interpret for him because he couldn't speak these Indian languages. And finally, he was able to reach a convert by the name of Tatamy. And Tatamy was not only able to understand English, but he was able to interpret concepts. So he was able then to help Indian people grab the significance of words like grace and atonement. And this was very helpful to Brainard as he continued his ministry with Native people. I think at this point, we'll turn on the second half of the video, and then we'll maybe have some time afterwards for a little bit of discussion.
One of the real turning points in Brainard's life and ministry is when he makes the decision to seek out other ministry opportunities with a group of Indians in southern New Jersey at a town called Crosswicksling, just east of Trenton.
He finds this Indian village. It was sort of surrounded by colonial settlement, but clearly a Delaware village. And he talks about preaching and said, well, there was only a few women who heard me preach. His diary doesn't seem to suggest he's particularly excited, but he makes the comment in his diary that they went off and told other people that I was preaching. Now, what's really important about this is that within the Delaware culture, the religious leaders are men, but the women are considered to be the keepers of religious knowledge and religious value. And so when these women hear him preach and go off to the rest of their people and say, you need to come and hear this religious person preach, that's a very important cultural statement.
Just the fact that the women accepted him, even if the men accepted him, at the same rate as the women, but the women, because the tribes are matrilineal, the social networking would travel through these matrilineages, and women would get it out to their kin and kith that they liked what this guy was saying and come and listen. And if they liked it, then they would stay because they're searching for something positive because so much bad things are happening to Native peoples at this time.
Brainard never understands this. And then within a week or so of him preaching, it's, they're looking for food, and he's worried that they're all going to go off hunting, he's going to lose his audience, and they kill a number of deer close by, which means they can feed themselves for several weeks and there's no need to go hunting. And so he keeps his audience longer than he would have expected. Of course, Brainard sees this as the hand of God. Probably Brainard is preaching in the way he'd preached during the revival meetings, which would have been very animated, walking about. This also fit with Delaware culture, that spiritual values would be translated or presented in a very animated fashion. Again, he didn't know that he was doing this, I don't think, but he is. He's making some cultural connections, completely unaware of what he's doing. Revival begins to break out. And what he describes is basically what you would see happening in New Haven, in Northampton, in other places during the height of the awakenings. People falling down, people bursting into tears over their sins, people going into long prayer times, talking about visions from God. Tatamy is able to translate these concepts of the Delawares, so he's not just doing a word-for-word translation.
Brainard describes the revival in his diary, 1745, August 8th. In the afternoon I preached to the Indians. There was much visible concern among them while I was discoursing publicly. But afterwards, when I spoke to one and another more particularly, whom I perceived under much concern, the power of God seemed to descend upon the assembly like a rushing mighty wind, and with an astonishing energy bore down all before it. I stood amazed at the influence that seized the audience almost universally.
It had an impact on their marriages, had impact on their debt. A lot of the American Indians were in debt through drinking, and all of that changed. They would not take revenge on past offenses. These were all kinds of effects that the gospel had among those that were converted. It was profound change.
As the revival continues, more Indians come in. When these new Indians turn up, they build huts or put up tents, not in the middle of the village, but the converted Delawares are now going to them and preaching. So a lot of these new Indians are hearing the gospel not from Brainard, but from other Indians. And he writes this frequently, that he would go to bed and they would continue to have prayer meetings, or they would be singing songs in their huts, or they would go out and visit the new arrivals and preach to them the gospel. And so I think what's really significant about this is a sort of self-replicating revival. This is not just Brainard. He is now, in a sense, creating what Christians would see as disciples, people that are continuing his work. And he's effectively now functioning as a pastor to a Native American settlement. It becomes, there's obviously knowledge of it is spreading out, because he often writes about, quote unquote, the white people that walk all around causing trouble. And so you get the impression that this Native American revival is sort of a tourist attraction, that local whites are turning up to see what the heck is going on. And there's a number of occasions where he preaches to both whites and Indians at the same time, which again is pretty remarkable for this period of time.
But there's no doubt that Brainard developed tremendous affection for the members of his congregation, especially those in Crossweeksing, where he recorded many times very personal and intimate conversations and encounters with them in their homes. And a key element of his ministry was to go into homes and talk one-on-one with these congregants. I think there's no getting around the fact that Brainard and his own emotional well-being was very much connected to these native peoples. Word of his success began to spread. His public diary is going to be a means through which he can spread the word. The very way in which he constructs that account is going to be important. It's going to describe the revival very much as Jonathan Edwards had described the revival in Northampton. And so it's less an account of a missionary successfully evangelizing Indians and more an account of a congregation, in this case a congregation of native peoples, having a true revival.
What is happening for Brainard in New Jersey in many ways is part of a wider movement. One of them was among the Narragansetts in 1742. A large number, over 100 Narragansetts, also begin to affiliate with Christianity, and they join a church. They form a church, a native church, and eventually have a native minister there as well. On Long Island, the Montaukets and Shinnecocks also begin to form a local native indigenous church. In parts of Connecticut, the Mohegans, the Niantics, and the Pequots also form small native-run and native-led churches. And so there's a sense in which the 1740s is the beginning, not exclusively or not definitively, but in some of these regions, it is the beginning of what people referred to as an indigenous Christianity, whereby natives themselves are appropriating Christian ideas and idioms and practices, and then making them their own, in part by having their own church structures and by having their own native ministers and so forth.
Brainard decides that since God is working, it would be a good time to go back out to Susquehanna again. But he does something that I think, again, is really significant, because he takes a number of the Delaware converts with him. But there's also clearly changes going on in his life, because at one point in the journey, he separates from the Delawares. Don't really know why, that doesn't do anything terrible, but he stays with some settlers. And the settlers clearly weren't very religious. He spends a couple of nights with them on the road. And he meets up again with his Delaware converts, and he writes that it's so good to be back amongst my people again. And so what's happened by this point in time is that he feels increasingly uncomfortable around non-religious white people and more comfortable around religious Indians. Now, this is not a suggestion here. Brainard never gets away from the superiority of European culture, or what we'd probably see today as racism. But he's clearly making a bond with these people, that he's very comfortable with them in ways that he's not comfortable with not particularly religious white people. So anyway, he gets out to Susquehanna, to Shamokin again. It's not particularly successful. What's interesting is he has some of his Delaware converts speak to the people there. They're, in a sense, if we look at it in 20th century terms, he's the preacher, and the converts are sharing their testimony. So they're telling the story of their conversions.
In the spring of 1746, he went on this exploratory mission to find a new home for the Christians of Crossweeksung. And he came upon a place called Cranberry, and it was just north, not too far, 20 miles or so north of Crossweeksung. So in the late spring, early summer of 1746, they moved up there. About 130 people moved up to Cranberry.
Brainard becomes very excited about what's going on at Crossweeksung and then at Cranberry, where they relocate. And so what he continually points people to in these public diaries is the same signs that you would see as a sign of conversion in a European church, I'm seeing in a Native American church. He very deliberately writes this narrative, and I think this is the other thing that's very interesting. A number of historians have pointed out that the revival narratives that emerge in the 1740s and 1750s have a general type. And Brainard's description of the revival of the Native Americans effectively fits into that structure. To me, this is his way of saying this revival is every bit as legitimate as the revival at Northampton.
Brainard made one final trip to the Susquehanna, and it is noteworthy less for the success he might have had in terms of Indian responsiveness, and more because of what it reveals about his worsening physical condition. In some sense, maybe it wasn't the most prudent thing to do at a time when he would have been coughing up blood and suffering from a disease for which there was very little treatment in the 18th century.
What we understand about consumption, looking back, that it looks to be tuberculosis, as we call it today. So tuberculosis is an infection carried by a very strong bacteria that's very resistant. It takes very powerful antibiotics to kill it over a longer period of time than normal infections. And it's still a very deadly disease in our world today. Tuberculosis is an illness that primarily attacks the lungs first and mainly, but then spreads out to all of our organs, including our brain. So it can lead to significant brain effects on mood, on judgment, on psychoses and hallucinations and those kind of things, as well as the primary effects on the lungs. Probably the closest thing that people have a lot of contact with is maybe lung cancer, where cancer starts to eat at the lung, can metastasize to many different areas of the body and debilitate the rest of the body. But as it affects the lungs first, fever, chills, night sweats, interference with sleep, and then as it continues to affect the lungs and wears away the lining of the lungs, then you start to vomit or cough up blood and start to feel like you're choking because you don't have that much lung power to work. And so those are the symptoms that Brainard initially complained of spitting up blood. That's why he was given time off from Yale. And as he talked about the significant symptoms towards the end of his life, it was really that process of feeling like he's vomiting blood all the time, in combination with his choking, that were the significant symptoms that he had.
Finally gets home, there's some backwards and forwards, we don't have all the details with society representatives, and they decide that they're going to have his brother John come and pick up the work at Cranberry. John has been ordained. David now wants to go back to New England to visit people, he writes in his journal, but probably also to say goodbye, realizing that he may not have much time left to live. There's a farewell service, he cries, the Native Americans cry, he begins the journey back to New England.
But he's so ill that he can't continue. And so his acquaintance and friend, Jonathan Dickinson, takes him into his home in November of 1746 in Elizabethtown. So during the winter, the end of 1746 and early 1747, he's in the home of Jonathan Dickinson. And a number of people come and visit him. By this point, he has a certain amount of reputation.
Brainard had actually published his journal in two parts, one in early 1746, covering the period through the second half of 1745, and then the second part, probably around July of 1746, had been published by a well-known publisher in Philadelphia named William Bradford, and it seems to have been fairly widely circulated. So there was certainly, his work was becoming known. Now, how widespread and how many people, we can't really say, but clearly people knew about it. And the other way that we know that he was becoming well known was there were people in New Jersey who wanted the Indian land. And they began to gin up stories that Brainard was creating an Indian base to launch attacks on settlers because there were thousands of Indians coming there, which there weren't. So we sort of know by his enemies, too, that the reputation was spreading.
And it was at this very time that Jonathan Dickinson receives a charter to begin a new college, the College of New Jersey. And so it starts in 1746, that fall, while David Brainard is in his home and trying to recuperate from his tuberculosis, get better. But it was also during this time that classes start to meet in that early spring, that springtime of 1747 in Jonathan Dickinson's home, while Brainard is there. And that is the first class of what is now called Princeton University.
While Brainard was traveling back to New England, and his destination was probably Boston, he came to Northampton, Massachusetts, which would have been pretty close to the road on the way back to Boston or into Boston. Edwards, by this point in time, was very well known, had a very good reputation. He had already published some of his most important works. We know that Brainard had read at least one of them. Edwards and Brainard had some acquaintance. I don't think they were particularly close friends, but Edwards had preached at Yale when Brainard was there. He had been at the Appeal to Clap. And the Edwards family also had a reputation for taking in travelers. In fact, when Brainard arrived in Northampton, a friend of his, a man named Eleazar Wheelock, who would later become quite famous in the colonies, was actually there being cared for by the Edwards family. He was also sick.
And so much of the care for Brainard as he was trying to recuperate, though the prospects of any full recovery were dim at this point, was given over to Jonathan's daughter, Jerusha. The relationship that develops between David and Jerusha has been one of much interest through the centuries. In the 19th century, evangelicals developed the notion that these two had become romantically involved. There really is no evidence for that, though it makes for a good story. At most, it would appear as though Jerusha and David became friends, and she was, in fact, his caretaker.
It was a very difficult season. Over the course of his writing, journaling life, I think there were something like 22 entries of Brainard longing to die.
And then in October of 1747, he finally dies. There's a funeral service that Edwards presides at, and he's actually then buried in the Northampton Cemetery. Jerusha sadly dies not long afterwards, and there's the suspicion that she may have contracted tuberculosis from nursing Brainard. And Edwards does have her buried next to Brainard in the cemetery, which has also sparked a great deal of speculation, but it was the family plot.
When he died, he was 29 years old, young, and for such a young man to have lived so much. Through it all, I think what impressed Edwards was his devotion to God. He had a strong communion and fellowship with God that I think when Edwards read his journal and his diary, he said this would be very beneficial to the public.
By the time that Brainard died in Edward's house in 1747, Edwards was beginning a dispute with some members of his church over the issues of membership. Going back into the 1600s, to be a member of a Puritan church, you had to provide a conversion narrative that was agreed on by the minister. Until you had become a member, you couldn't take communion. This had changed in the intervening years where people had to be living a good life, and they could take communion. Edwards wanted to take his church back to the old version. He wanted to impose membership rules, to bar people from communion. He wanted people to not just be living a decent life, but a truly converted life. And I believe that in Brainard, he saw the exemplar of this, that Brainard was an example of the life that was truly converted, someone who wasn't just a good person, but was living for God. And so I think he saw in Brainard not just, oh, this is a good story, but this is the story of someone who's truly converted. This is what true conversion looks like. Maybe you're not working with Indians, but your life has radically changed. You're not just running your business and raising your family and coming to church on Sunday. And I think that this was the primary motivation for why Edwards wanted to publish the life. And also why he edited it. He shortened it up. He took out a lot of the melancholy stuff. He removed some of the references to the more radical events of the Yale days because he didn't want people being too radical. It became very widely read. More copies of the life of Brainard were published than all the theological works that Edwards published. And I think what happened in Northampton was people went, this is the kind of life we have to live to be a member? No, thank you very much. And probably accelerated the process that got him fired by his church in 1751 over this dispute over what membership was going to be.
Those British evangelicals were also impacted by the fact that John Wesley put out an edition of the life of David Brainerd as well in the 1760s. And so in some respect, Brainerd's fame was connected to the fact that arguably the two most important and influential evangelicals of the 18th century on the two sides of the Atlantic, Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley, had both found in Brainerd's life story a compelling account of Christian service and missionary dedication that they wanted to make known.
Edwards had presented Brainerd as how to live a good Christian life. The new versions present how to be a missionary. And so there are new rewrites of Brainerd's life, condensations of it, abridged versions, which emphasize missions. Brainerd has.
I think I'll stop it there so we have some time to talk a little bit. I have books about David Brainerd's life. I'm willing to lend them. This is a copy that actually is in the old style print. And I would be happy for anybody to see it. I also have a copy of this particular presentation, if anybody would like. You will, I think, find it interesting, possibly, if I tell you about the life a little bit of Samson Occam. He was mentioned in this today. Samson Occam was a Mohegan. He was converted as a very young man, and despite all the odds against him, he learned English. Then he learned Greek, Latin, and Hebrew besides, and became the first Presbyterian, full-blooded Indian missionary to his people and other peoples, other native peoples. Well, that was a very unusual thing to have somebody of his nature and intellect. There was such prejudice against Indians that, my goodness, this guy is really quite accomplished, despite the fact that he is an Indian that's supposed to be some kind of subhuman species. He was befriended and coached by a minister by the name of Eleazar Wheelock, who was also mentioned. And Occam, pardon me, was really adamant about having a school for Indian people so that they could be able to defend themselves in what was increasingly becoming a white world. And there were treaty negotiations they didn't understand, all kinds of reasons why it was important for Indian people to begin to understand reading, writing, and all the arithmetic, the whole thing. So he talked to Wheelock about starting an Indian school. And Wheelock said, you know what? You'll never be able to raise the money to do an Indian school here because there's too much prejudice against Native people. However, there's a lot of interest in Native people in Europe. And if you are willing to go to Europe, I think you can raise money there. But this time, Occam had a wife and 10 children, and it was a real hard decision for him to leave them. But Wheelock promised that he would look after his family while he was gone if he would do this. So he took off, and with another man, and over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, they raised a lot of money. He preached some 300 different sermons. He had came home with about 11 or 12,000 pounds. Arrived home to find out that Wheelock had not taken care of his family. In fact, they were on the verge of starvation, his wife and his children, and he was very angry about it. But that was compounded by the fact that Wheelock decided not to build the Indian school. He, in fact, decided to take the money and go up into New Hampshire and start another school for whites up there. Does anybody want to guess what the name of it is? Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College, yeah. So the remarkable thing about Occam through all of this is that he never lost his faith, despite all of the things that were thrown against him by supposed Christian people, some of them even in the clergy. He retained his faith and retained his commitment to Christ, and what he understood was to be the example we set as Christian people, which is a remarkable thing. I don't know that I could have been that way. But it's a very interesting story, and if sometime you want to hear it, I'll be glad to do a presentation on it, or you can borrow a book, or you can go online and read lots of stories about Samson Occam. But that's a very important part of the early history of the Presbyterian Church, because Samson Occam was a Presbyterian minister. His book has got a lot of sermons in it. He wrote a lot of hymns, many of which are still available to be played and sung today. A remarkable human being, a real hero, I think, to all of us, not just because he was an Indian or because he was a minister, but because his faith was so deep that he was able to transcend all the things that had been thrown against him. As a person who endured a lot of prejudice, lived with a lot of hardships. Another example of it is when he was asked to take up a ministry to another group of Indian people. He was paid 1/6 of what normal missionaries were given because he was not deemed to be of the same standard as whites who were occupying that kind of position. So when you talk about prejudice, this is it's a wonderful story in Presbyterian terms, but it also has some very distressing aspects to it that we need to understand, because it's a part of our history. And I hope maybe at some point in time it'll be interesting to you, because I love to research this stuff, and I always get more out of preparing a lesson like this than I'm sure any of you get by listening to it. But I guess in wrapping this up, would just say to you that we need to have, as we have always been asked to in this church, to, have a biblical application and practical application to what we do in terms of our teaching. And so if we go back to what is the basis for what Samson Occam or David Brainard were doing, we're back to the words of Christ, and we're back to the Great Commission. And we find that in Matthew. And I'll read it to you. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Now, one more thing, I think how can we talk about David Brainard and Samson Occam and their complete and wholehearted commitment to God, and then not say to those who are listening online or in this recording that salvation is available to all of us. And if any of you have never experienced that, it's very simple, but it needs to be offered. How can we talk about these people and what they've committed and not extend that offer in this generation to anyone who sees? And so if you go to Romans 10, 9 and 10, I'll read it to you. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So it's such a simple process intellectually, but it also involves a change of the heart. And I invite any of you who have listened to these words, have not made that commitment, to consider it and prayerfully see if God's calling you to that. Amen. Thank you all for coming.